Morning.
So while we get settled, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your institution, your function, we're happy to have you here this morning. Okay. Well, good morning. We are here in different parts of New York. Jason's in Brooklyn. I'm in Long Island. I'm not sure if any of you who are joining us are at the conference or also hailing from different parts of the country, but welcome this morning to our roundtable presentation entitled "You Are Doing It Wrong: Overcoming Resistance Through Democratic Practice in Innovative DEI Work." So my name is Helen Margaret Nasser. I am the director of the Office of Student Life and the Student Union and Intercultural Center at Kingsborough Community College in Brooklyn, New York.
And I'm Jason Leggett. I teach legal studies at Kingsborough Community College, and I'm an assistant professor.
So during today's conversation, we'll share our reflections and analysis over the past 10 years in the hopes that these help you to resist detours and obstacles to DEI implementation in the struggle ahead. Okay, welcome, Gail. Thanks for being with us today.
Good morning.
Good morning. What's your role at the college, Gail, if you don't mind telling us?
I'm actually not at the college. I used to be at Clemson University, where I directed the portfolio program, but now I work for PebblePad, and we've been participating at PebblePad and Clemson at AACU for many, many years. So I'm happy to be here, virtually, but happy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. And Brandy, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but would you mind introducing yourself?
Brandy said we're closed caption.
Okay, good to know. All right, thank you. All right, Gail, so it's a nice intimate session. If you've got any questions, feel free to raise your hand or mention it in the chat. So you can see, and you know, some of you may be familiar with this initiative from the AACNU. We began working together in 2011 under the Bridging Cultures to Form a Nation grant. That was a collaborative grant effort with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Democracy Commitment. From the start, we were told to conform to marginal change efforts that quickly turned into impasse and conflict. And we resisted and we persisted. So just to give a little bit more context, so Jason, a faculty member, myself as an administrator, it was unlikely for us to team up, but we teamed up out of that initiative and we continued to work together. It was a 3-year grant, so even after the 3-year grant concluded, you know, we realized that the work that we were working on was important, was meaningful, and that the two of us had the wherewithal to kind of keep seeing it through despite, you know, usual institutional effort, institutional conflicts of budget, interest, time, payment, things like that. So Kingsborough Community College is located in Brooklyn, New York, and we're a very diverse campus. Everyone's hit enrollment declines these past couple of years, but you know, our student population is usually around 10,000 students. They come from over 140 different countries. They speak over 70 different languages. Very representative of the borough that we're in. Brooklyn and Queens are two of the most diverse areas of the country. So, it was very apparent to Jason and I that our students had diverse interests and diverse needs. So we came up with these 4 areas of concern: immigration, migration, and changing citizenship, interfaith dialogue, intercultural competence, and anti-racism. So you may wonder how we were able to identify these 4 areas of concern. And, quite frankly, it was pretty easy because we were observing our students. We were working with our students. We were engaging them in dialogue and conversation. And as we got to know them and as we were able to build trust and relationships with them, they were able to tell us what their struggles were. And then we were able to kind of see how we could work with them to help address some of their concerns. And then you can kind of see from the rest of the table that there was some resistance, there were some usual detours of not seeing these areas of concern as problems for our students and quickly trying to dismiss efforts to engage in these areas of conversation. So for instance, for example, with interfaith dialogue, there was hostility, there was there were lawsuits. Students felt that they were used as pawns, and then staff tried to steer clear. With immigration, students were scared. They tried to, their status was in a very volatile position, and they didn't know who to trust, what they could do, who they could disclose their concerns with. And these things for our students do affect their persistence, do affect their ability to complete their degrees.
So we wanted to talk about some of our students that we were working with, and one of those students that both Helen and I worked with was named Renee. And really, right off the bat, Renee and a bunch of other students in one of my classes were really concerned about their immigration status and what was going on around DACA and whether that was going to be continued to be administered at the institution. Our institution was in the institutions where there was a lot of controversy going back and forth about whether information would be shared with Homeland Security, whether students would be able to receive financial aid, and there was a lot of insecurity, obviously. So I opened up the classroom space to examine a lot of these issues about immigration, about law, and then we created co-curricular activities through Helen, and we tried to think about the big picture of immigration categories. So a lot of the language was really focused on kind of just a particular type of immigrant, and wasn't recognizing migration patterns, historical legacies, and then just the concept of changing citizenship, which is something that AACU talks a lot about. But we wanted to kind of put this into the perspective of how did our students feel about it. And one of the things that came across pretty early on is that other classes weren't really recognizing the difference between settlers and immigrants, and that they also weren't really putting things in a context of colonialism. So a lot of our students were coming from places where colonial knowledge was very near to them. They understood that concept, but they weren't feel like they were being heard in their own classroom. So they were very scared, and probably rightfully so, but a lot of faculty were making things far worse. And so Helen opened up a space where they could talk with each other, where we could cross-dialogue with other faculty. And at the time, staff were very much disinterested in getting involved. They were really, which makes student services very kind of anemic. And so that space also opened up for kind of one at a time, where staff were able to come in and start expressing their own insecurities. We realized we had a lot of staff that had concerns that weren't being addressed either. And so we kind of had this lovely cross-dialogue that emerged. And over time, Renee actually came and worked for both of us. She became an institutional leader, and she worked out with other groups out in the community for immigration advocacy and to continue her art practice. And so we saw this as kind of our first experience. It was by no means our last experience, but it was our first experience where we recognized that Helen and I really had to come together and redesign curriculum in a way that connected to co-curricular experiences that would open up the possibilities for different groups to engage in dialogue with one another. Helen, would you like to speak about another student?
Yeah, so another student that I had the real honor to work with, she was experiencing housing insecurity because of her her legal her undocumented status, and it was causing her emotional stress. It was causing her. She was unsure whether she would be able to complete her degree, and I just remember having this interaction with a friend of mine, and I was so frustrated because at the time, Kingsborough's financial supports and emergency funds were not made available to students without a social security number. Whereas if students did have a social security number, they were able to get emergency funding to kind of help them continue in their studies. So I was very frustrated because I said, here's a student, an honors student, who's ready to go, dedicated, committed, has withstood so many challenges and tribulations. And here we've got the funds, but we can't give them to her. And I remember sharing that with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine actually, outside of work. And she said, oh, well, she shouldn't really be here in the first place. And I just felt so frustrated by that statement. And I said, it doesn't matter. I said, this is a student that's in front of me that I need to help. That's the purpose of my job right now. So it showed that there was also a lot of need on our campus to educate our faculty and staff in terms of how to sensitively work with and approach and help our DACA and undocumented students. So since then, CUNY has launched an initiative called Undocu Ally in partnership with the Dream.us scholarship, and we run these workshops. I facilitate these workshops twice every semester, open to faculty and staff, just explaining to them the nuances of being DACA and undocumented, how to understand if a student is in distress, how to approach students sensitively, and how to make referrals knowingly. So this was important for us as we worked towards building a campus that was more open and trusting for our students who might be DACA and undocumented. Since then, I'm happy to report also that CUNY has made some changes. They don't require social security numbers anymore for emergency funding. So emergency funding and any KCC Foundation scholarships are available to all students regardless of citizenship. There was also a time where the social security number was the prime way of identifying students when you were working on their transcript or helping them out. So that's also no longer a practice. So we were able to take small steps in terms of recognizing how small practices that we do in our day-to-day operations could be very challenging and very stressful for our students who are DACA and undocumented.
So building on that, I want to talk about one more student, Shantasha, who is involved in the early work we were doing on immigration, but was also interested in anti-racism work, particularly after the murder of Trayvon Martin. And we were in an environmental politics class, and so Shantasha was very interested in figuring out how to combine environmental justice with racial injustice as a platform for her to do her own community-based work. And so through Helen, because we had been collaborating in the past and we were starting to open up spaces, we decided to put on, or help students put on, a college-wide EcoFest day where they would work with each other to plan an event, and they'd bring their various projects that we're working on and share those with other students. Shantasha really took amazing amounts of leadership in that project, and I should say two things. This was a single mother who was also not an honor student when she started at Kingsborough, but by the time she finished Kingsborough, she had become an honor student and had found her place in really that crossroads where social justice, anti-racism, and environmental justice all come together. And one of the big opportunities for her was through a variety of offices. Karen Washington came to speak, and Shantasha was very influenced by that perspective, and she really started to mold herself in that pattern. And so she immediately came back the next week and was just organizing with students every day in class. And then I'd see her out in the hallways, and she was talking to students there, and this kind of just kept the ball rolling. And by the time we put on the event, we had over 30 students who were sharing their work and who are now forming this kind of little organic club built around these issues that they cared about. And I think this was really this product of that early work we were doing on immigration that then kind of grew and grew and grew. And we kind of became known as the place where people felt comfortable to come share these experiences.
I think it's also important to mention that through our work, we were looking at what students had as innate skills. So it was very important for us to empower our students. A lot of times they felt that they didn't have the skills. They needed to first get a degree or a fancy job or have all of these credentials in order to contribute. So we really wanted to take a deliberate effort to recognize that they have what it takes right now to contribute, to participate, and to be making changes. So these are some of the events that we hosted around the theme of immigration. So through the Student Union and Intercultural Center, we hosted a theater performance called De Novo. It was based on a true story of a young man who came to this country, and then it goes through the legal proceedings of his deportation. We also had a film screening about The Unafraid, a documentary film that talks about youth in Georgia, where they were where there are laws that prohibit them from continuing in their higher education. And the state tuition in Georgia is actually much more expensive for DACA and undocumented students. That makes it much more prohibitive for them to complete. We also worked closely with the grassroots organization Make the Road New York. So we looked closely to show the students that there is activity, there are ways that you can get involved, and also for others to understand that, you know, this is not a singular phenomenon that might be happening to one of your students. This is something that's pervasive, and how can we make sure that we are more accommodating and aware of how we can help students get involved. Make the Road New York is a great organization, and again, students don't know where to start. So they think they have to create something. And I say, no, look, there are these organizations that already exist that need volunteers, that need your skills, that need you to help contribute. So it was great for them to kind of see that, again, their experience wasn't singular, and they have things that they can contribute. The documentary of The Unafraid follows high school students, and you, you can see their activism and their bravery as high school students, the risks that they're willing to take, the ways that they're fighting to pave roads for others. So really inspiring stories that wherever you fall, whether you're DACA or undocumented, whether you're a faculty, student, staff member, you see that this is something that requires everybody's attention, contribution, and energy.
These also serve as artifacts of our institution. We wanted to go back through the last 10 years and pull examples of ways that we worked against the resistance, way we worked against people who were telling us we didn't have to do these events, that they weren't necessary, that we shouldn't do these things. We also wanted to show how these collaborations, which seem small at first, so bringing a theater production doesn't seem like it's a large activity. I'm sure Helen can explain how difficult it can be, but when you just look at a flyer, you don't think that's a huge undertaking. But when students go to this event and then they go to another event, what it does is when they come back to the classroom, they have lots of new ideas that they wouldn't otherwise have, that just focusing on, say, textbook learning. So this particular session, students were interested in putting together a documentary using video clips, survey data that they collected from students across the campus, personal interviews that they did with faculty and staff on campus, and they put everything together into this documentary about how criminal justice and immigration, or what's now called crimmigration, were beginning to just kind of take root. I think this was around 2015, 2016, and really become clear to them that this is the approach that the country was going in. And so again, this kind of got students to see things as a much more active, or saw their own agency, because they were hearing from other folks largely around their same ages, who are practically putting into those advocacy issues into practice, and this kind of got them to see the same thing. Moving on to interfaith issues, I'll start off by just prepping this is that one thing that we started learning how to do pretty quickly was use Google Forms to have students talk about their experiences after they went to this event. So I saw this as another way of integrating curricular and co-curricular activities. And I think I was really not shocked, but I was really amazed at the about how much students wanted to share about their experiences when it came to immigration, interfaith, anti-racism, and cultural issues. But they didn't feel as comfortable talking about it in dialogue in the classroom as they did in sharing over Google Forms, which were largely anonymous. Sometimes students would give their names or their email addresses because they wanted to be in contact or they wanted to be connected to certain groups. But because it was anonymous, most people felt that they could share more and really revealed a lot of the things that we suspected was going on. When you have faculty suing each other over these issues, we thought that probably trickled down into the classroom and students were thinking about these things, but we didn't know for sure. We started to know for sure when we got the feedback from the students, and that really made us feel even more urgent and that we really needed to do something as quickly as possible and really reestablish the idea that we had to work together.
And the importance here is also that, you know, you might say, oh, we've got an office for that, or, oh, we have this resource. But for students, that might not always be enough. So we really wanted to make this embedded into our culture as a campus so that students see themselves fully represented in who we invite to speak, in who we have as commencement speakers, as what are we talking about, what are we recognizing, what are we celebrating, so that it's more than just these token statistics that we brag about, but it's really making sure that the students feel comfortable and acknowledged in what we're doing. So I think the challenge here is, you know, with the interfaith, you know, you can imagine, what if a student says this, and that's what happened. We had a session where there was a Q&A and a student asked a question, and it was seemed as controversial and too pointed, but it was a genuine question that a student had. So you can see the response that these are the questions students have, these are the conversations they want to have, but sometimes in an area where there's too much control, the college doesn't feel comfortable creating that space. So then we had to make sure that we were positioning ourselves to create spaces for safe dialogue and for students to come with their questions and concerns to bridge greater understanding. So we would host these interfaith meet and greet sessions so that students could come and see what was some common ground. How do you celebrate this holy day, or why do you celebrate this holy day? And also see that even amid these different religions, there are things that are very much in common. And we also celebrated and we commemorate Yom HaShoah, which is the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. And there as well, we brought in multi-modalities. We had a documentary film screening. We had an intergenerational performance between Holocaust survivors and high school students that brought in hundreds of community members to our school to see this performance, as well as a visit to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And there you can see that students see that something that seems so distant, the Holocaust, although it isn't quite so distant, but they can see parallels in their own experiences of racism or persecution or discrimination and see that this is something that doesn't quite go away. So again, we're looking for different ways of engaging students, different ways of making them feel comfortable and seen on campus, as well as different entry points and access points for folks to see that this is something that's pretty universal. Even if it doesn't affect you directly, why should you care about it? How can you still advocate for it?
Now, immigration and faith issues are obviously controversial, especially if you look at the news. And yet at Kingsborough, intercultural divides were what we were facing as our most treacherous area on the campus. We already kind of said that the leadership at the campus was old and white, mostly men. They weren't interested in facilitating dialogues around intercultural issues. Students were tracked, focused on career areas, and so they didn't have spaces where they could talk with one another about these issues they were going through, and the staff were divided on whether this was necessary at all. Even though privately staff would talk about areas in which they felt that they were not being respected or that their cultures weren't being valued, they weren't sure there was anything they could do about it because of the environment we were in. So Helen and I, even though we were told not to, and even though we were told we were doing it wrong, decided to push through and really capitalize on the messages that Kingsborough was putting in their documentations and on their website about, we have something called the Hall of Flags, where we say that we represent a variety of backgrounds, nationalities, and languages, but we weren't really doing anything with that, right? We just had this Hall of Flags. We weren't really doing anything in it. We weren't doing anything with students, and we wanted to move past that. So the student example I bring here is what I started doing in the classroom is allowing or encouraging students to share other ways of thinking that might represent their own culture. This is an excerpt from a longer poem by a student, but we got a lot of poetry, a lot of drawings, we got some videos, we had lots of variety of work product that showed us the wide variety that we had in the classroom and we could document into artifacts. That also coincided with events that Helen was putting on, where students were hearing from people who looked like them, who sounded like them, who had experiences like them, and where they could exchange different ideas. And we really saw this come together in a way that was very inspiring and that I think did have a lasting impact on the college. The leadership has changed dramatically in the time that we've been there, and there is much more dialogue amongst people. Helen, if you want to talk about these two events as representatives.
Sure. So we hosted an International Peace Day, which was something that the college had never acknowledged before. And it was a celebration in our Hall of Flags, like Jason had spoken about, that really just brought the different nationalities of our students. They're in class together. A lot of them have fled war zones. A lot of them have fled border conflicts between different countries, and then they find themselves in the same classroom. So I think there's a richness that our students bring because of that diversity. They have lived experiences coming from different political structures, different experiences coming from different countries, and we bring that together and let them know that that's a richness that enhances how our classroom dialogues can go, because there's a different perspective that we can hear and understand and bridge. So International Peace Day strive to bring that more to the forefront. Again, also during the pandemic, a lot of students were experiencing this but didn't know how to express themselves. So we brought in Dr. Vivian Hua to talk about the rise of anti-Asian racism in the age of COVID-19. And what Dr. Hua was able to do was also introduce that this is not new. There has been anti-Asian sentiment in this country throughout history. And to draw those parallels and call upon resources and support and actions that can be taken. So it also helped validate a lot of the experiences and perspectives that our students were feeling that they might not have felt comfortable disclosing or sharing. Saying, maybe it's just happening to me, or maybe it's just me and has nothing to do with me being Asian, so they didn't know how to articulate what they're experiencing. So when we bring in speakers like this, it validates their perspectives and makes them feel more courageous to take action and to speak up for themselves and for others. Another important part of what Dr. Hua talked about was bystander support. So maybe you're not the one experiencing this anti-Asian racism, but what can you do if you see it happen? What can you do to rectify it as an individual? So I think that was also another great part of the conversation in terms of unifying experiences.
Now, Helen and I were involved in anti-racist work very early on when we were working together, but it had not coalesced into the terminology that we tend to use today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. At that time, the language was mostly about social justice, and on my end, we were looking at criminal justice issues, and at Helen's end, they were looking at college-wide issues that were affecting the college itself. However, each semester I would poll students, I would ask them which issues they cared about the most, and consistently, semester after semester, students would talk about anti-racism and racial discrimination as subjects that they wanted to talk about in their classes that they weren't hearing from their other faculty, other teachers. They weren't getting the experience that they really were hoping to get in class. I had made substantial changes to the curriculum to make sure that this became the focal point of what we were talking about. But anybody who's kind of tried to do this in the classroom has run into a similar obstacle. At some point, students are feeling kind of down, right? You study this systemic oppression, you study discrimination, and you really want to have this opportunity for students to start engaging in social change. So I spent a lot of time in Helen's office, and we talked as much as we possibly could about how to construct activities on the campus that would be inspiring, that we'd hear from people who have done work in the field, but that would also bring very actual concrete opportunities for students to get engaged at the level that Helen had described, where they could bring the skills that they already had and combine those with the learning that they were getting in the classroom to start to work on solutions to these problems that they thought should be studied at college but were undervalued or were not being represented the way that they wanted them to be. So Helen, if you want to talk about these two examples and how kind of that process you go through when you invite speakers to make sure they're relevant to students.
Sure. So the first one we invited Dr. Jelani Cobb to speak to our students. And I remember when I sent that email out to the faculty and the college community, I got so many responses. Wow, how'd you get him to come? How'd you get him to come? I said, I just emailed, I just asked, and he accepted. So some things like that seem so prohibitive. You just put it out there and you give it a shot and you see. I often ask faculty for recommendations of speakers, of who they'd like to hear from. I sent out a survey to faculty at the end of each semester, asking them what they anticipate their course themes will be for the following semester, so that I can also invite speakers and develop programming that would complement what's going on in the curriculum. When we invited Dr. Jelani Cobb, he gave a lecture presentation open to the whole college, but then he was gracious enough to stay for an extra time to address specifically the gentleman at our Men's Resource Center that specifically works with our men of color to speak to them more personally and engage with them more directly so that they could ask their questions in a more intimate setting and feel supported and heard by the experience of Dr. Cobb. So that was an interesting way that we were able to take something that was open to the whole college, but still bring it down to a level that would be more accessible to our students that would want that access and make it more direct. We also engage with our students who are in the journalism major and work for our student newspaper by giving them access to our speakers to write articles, to interview the folks that we bring on campus. So that's just another way that we're empowering students and giving them access. Yes, you can interview Dr. Cobb. Yes, you can interview Heather Booth and write an article about it. So things that they may not feel comfortable asking, we're giving them the tools and the opportunity to build connections. When we brought Heather Booth, we had a whole day of sessions that she was also very gracious enough to host. So it was a whole day program where at every hour there were different elements that she would really get down to the granular level of how to organize change. What skills do you need? What are the steps that you need to take? So it was a very hands-on, very interactive experience that faculty brought their classes to. So it was a whole day event. And it really helps students understand that, again, you might be one person, but this is something that you're able to contribute to. These are changes that you're able to make. So we had a film screening and several other workshops with Heather Booth that the students were able to participate. And when you bring in folks that look like our students, that talk about things that are relevant to our students' experiences, you get students who are showing up for more than just the free food. You get students who are there and engaged. And that shows in the exit surveys that we do, in the reflection assignments that the faculty asks the students to complete as part of that co-curricular work. So we're seeing that these things are much more extensive and much more intentional for our students to benefit from.
Now we wanted to share these artifacts, these flyers, the student work, to let you see how each of these pieces came together. When we were doing our ethnographic organization, of all of the work we'd been doing over the last 10 years, we noticed that issues had been siloed, as they are at many institutions, into these 4 separate categories: migration, intercultural, anti-racism, and interfaith. And there were certainly people who were working in those silos, but no one on our college was working across those roles, across those silos. So Helen and I really consciously made this effort. We walked thousands and thousands of steps across the campus in order to meet people where they were, to bring people together. And what we really noticed, which is kind of common sense, but it is not often employed, was that dialogue was critical to each stage of this process. And this part of the dialogue that was the most frustrating was that even though we were doing this work, we don't necessarily get recognized for this work. In fact, even to this day, we don't get recognized for much of the work we do. And a lot of this resistance is in the form of this phrase, which has now become my least favorite phrase in the world: you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as if the wheel was some kind of great invention. We are trying to get people to start to think about inventing spaceships, where the wheel has been reinvented. It is used in an entirely different way for anti-gravity, but also just to get people to get out of this habit of thinking that you don't have to change, you don't have to bring things together, you're doing it wrong, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. All of these statements are really supporting the status quo, meaning you don't actually have to make any kind of effort to go up against what is really forms of domination, segregation in many cases, and just negative experiences for students that you're really not even hearing because you're not having this dialogue across the roles. The other thing that we really wanted to reflect on and share was that there were 4 tools that we have seen that we use consistently when we're doing this work. And I'll have Helen end with explaining how she answers these 4 questions with this context.
Sorry. The first one is practicing courage. How do you strategically counter an action? So again, Jason and I have been reflecting on this work, and we've been at it for 10 years, which feels like a long time, doesn't feel like a long time, but we've kept at it. And again, as Jason explained, with little support, little recognition, little funding, the Student Union and Intercultural Center is relatively new at the institution. I'm largely a team of 1, and budgets were largely grant funded. So the college didn't give me much institutional support, but I was still able to be creative and clever on how we can get speakers to come that would work with our students. So you have to be creative, and you have to see how you can work against that. So I would get grants. I would look at folks who would be budget neutral. I would look for people who would want to come and work around their schedule. Zoom and virtual events have been also pretty cost efficient because we didn't have to pay for travel fees. But anyway, you get clever. You find ways to work around the inaction, and then you start to work with the folks who do want to create some action. So again, through the work that Jason and I have done, through the dialogues that we've had, we now also know who our campus partners are. Navigating difference. This is also important because you have to look inward and see what is important for you. What do you need to do to work with your students? What are the barriers that you hold from being able to come and speak openly to your students and to connect with them? Is there something that you're holding that makes it prohibitive for you to connect? Looking at the positionality that you have in your function at the college. What is your role? Who do you have to report to? What's your constituency? What do you look towards? What are your outcomes and deliverables at the end of the year? So those are things that we want folks to think about, but then that bottom line of how are we serving our students should also be always first and foremost. So again, recognizing that our students are in need of these types of events, activities, and connections, how can we work around those so-called barriers of positionality and budgets and outcomes, and see how we can make sure that we're consistently serving our students. As you've demonstrated, and Gail commented as well in the chat, constructing those safe spaces. Who do you rely on to help? So again, when we do those Undocu Ally trainings, every participant gets a placard that they can post outside their door. So that's recognizing that our students have a safe space, that they have allies that they could speak to, who can support them, and they understand that this is a safe space. So how do you construct yourself? How do you present yourself in the classroom? And I've had the privilege of traveling around to different classes, and you can see when faculty take the time to get to know their students, how the conversation moves much more freely. And there is that safe space where students can ask questions of one another, they can connect with one another, and then they also build those bonds. Oh, that's a challenge that's affecting you, that's affecting me too. And then again, they build that bond, they build that solidarity. So how do you construct that safe space? Again, recognizing your positionality, whether you're in the classroom, whether you're in an office, how are you making that space? So that way folks know that they can come to you for support and they can come to you for help. And finally, engendering agencies. So when we walk through these 4 tools, we want people to feel empowered. What are your metrics for success? So again, when we work with faculty, when we bring people together, they feel then empowered, like, oh, okay, Helen and Jason were able to do this. I can work with them. I can come to them and know that this can happen. I'll bring this event idea to Helen. She can bring this speaker in, and we can work on curriculum together to help make it a success. So you can think about those ways. And then when I work with faculty creating these co-curricular events, how do we take it further? Again, it's not just a guest speaker that they listen to. What are the further connections that we can make in terms of assignments, reflections, articles, connections that the students can make professionally in terms of internships and careers? So how can we get as much out of it? So those are the metrics for success in terms of my personal area, but they vary for different faculty. Maybe they want not just straight great grades, but are the students really interacting and bringing in their personal experiences in the assignments? So that's how we've been able to advocate for these 4 tools, and it's been effective for us. There obviously have been challenges, but we've been able to use these tools effectively in the 4 examples, the 4 areas that we've addressed. So that way we were able to create a campus culture that does reflect the needs and concerns and the diversity of our students so that it's a safer space.
Now, in person, we would have walked through each of these slowly and had dialogue around each of the areas, and we would have let you play with the flyers or ask questions at the time. Because we're on Zoom, we wanted to put everything forward first and then get some feedback and hopefully engage in our own constructive dialogue. So at this time, any reactions, comments, if anyone would like to participate, we'd surely appreciate it.